Ho, 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 general psychology students and Merry Pupmas. Um, I thought you would appreciate this little puppy Santa hat just because we're not meeting in person and we're getting really close to the end of the semester. This is the last week that I will be lecturing for you, and this is basically the end of the semester. So I kind of thought, in lieu of playing obnoxious holiday music at the beginning of class like I normally would, I figured I would teach to you in this ridiculous hat. I got it from American Eagle. It is very, very soft, but I have to keep it on my head or otherwise Smedley might try to eat it. So the last time that we were here, we were talking about basically an introduction to psychological disorders. And so now, this week, we are going to actually talk about those in depth. So just to give you a bit of perspective, it is Friday, December 4th. This is my last set of lectures to record this week. I am planning on putting these up on YouTube tomorrow so that you have enough time to watch these, learn from these before your fourth exam completes on Wednesday. And we are going to have a review session on Monday night at 7 o'clock. So if you have any last minute questions or concerns or anything like that, you will be good to go. So we're going to start our discussion of psychological disorders by starting with probably one of the most common types of disorders, especially now. We are going to talk about anxiety disorders. So anxiety disorders, by and large, are disorders that are marked by distressing or persistent anxiety or behaviors that are potentially designed or done to reduce that anxiety. So one of the things that I will kind of mention, so remember, that when we talk about psychological disorders, and this is especially true for anxiety disorders, we have to be very, very careful about paying attention to that line between what we would consider normal behavior and what we would consider disordered behavior. So if you are the kind of person that freaks out right before you have a test, you get a little tense, or it's the night before a big day when you're traveling and you're having trouble sleeping and shutting your brain off, let's be really clear. Those are absolutely normal ways to behave. What would be considered disordered is if this anxiety is persistent, you are having anxiety when no actual target is present. So if you're the kind of person that your anxiety is always picking a different target and it's never a static target, that's going to be an issue. If you find that it's disrupting your life and your ability to do your job, that is when we are going to say that that is disordered. But having anxiety before a big public speaking event or taking a test or a big nerve-wracking scary day like a job interview, these are normal things. You do not have an anxiety disorder if you are anxious about those things. Those are perfectly normal things to be anxious about. It's when it persists and it's disrupting your life that we consider it a problem. So we're going to talk about 3 different anxiety disorders, and we're also going to talk about former anxiety disorders. So prior to the publication of the DSM-5, OCD and PTSD were actually considered anxiety disorders. And as you'll see, I'm including them here because they do share some pretty important components. However, we do not, as of the DSM-5, we do not actually consider these anxiety disorders per se, despite having some similar features. OCD is considered more of an impulse control disorder. PTSD is considered a trauma disorder. So let's talk about these. So the first one that we're going to talk about is something that, Dr. Gilchrist is a little bit familiar with, generalized anxiety disorder, or GAD. Generalized anxiety disorder is marked by continuous, persistent worrying, and it's what we call a free-floating type of anxiety, so it is constantly shifting from topic to topic to topic. The object of worry is never a static thing. It is constantly moving and constantly shifting. Because of this constant state of persistent worry and tension, these people will also be very jittery. They might be on edge. They might be sleep deprived. So for a lot of people who end up developing this ends up developing, it's a very, very gradual onset. So for example, when I was kind of growing up, I would get anxious about certain things, but it kind of ramped up a bit, especially when I was in college. And we do find that because college brings in a lot of stress, that stress can often create, not necessarily create, I don't want to use the word create, but it can often facilitate and be an environment in which a disorder that you might have just had a predisposition to all of a sudden becomes full blown. Remember that we have a biopsychosocial model, and oftentimes disorders develop as a reaction to stressful conditions or maladaptive patterns of thought or behavior. For me, kind of looking back on it, because I only got a diagnosis of this a couple of years ago after my very, very bad year, I can kind of look back and say, you know, I probably had a problem well before my diagnosis. I remember in my junior year of college going up to my sister's dorm room when my computer had suddenly died and I wasn't able to complete a lab report in general chemistry, crying that I was going to lose my 4.0. And I lost a lot of sleep and a lot of time worrying about losing my 4.0. And I know for some of you, you're like, that is the biggest humble brag I've ever seen. And maybe it is. But part of the reason for that is that I was very much tied to my grades and my GPA. And I thought that that was my identity. And so I was like, if I don't have my 4.0, who am I? What am I going to be? I did lose my 4.0. The world didn't end. I still got to graduate school. I still got my PhD and things were fine. But I did notice that I have a tendency to have these over-analytical, overthinking, racing thought patterns that contribute to these things. So here are some other things that we know about GAD. So here are some other symptoms. Worrying very much about everyday things, having trouble controlling worries or feelings of nervousness. No, you know that you probably worry more than you should, so that's kind of a critical thing. You know that there's a normal level of worrying and you don't have it. You're exceeding that. Having trouble relaxing, having a hard time concentrating, easily startled, having trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, easily tired or tired all the time, hard time swallowing, twitching, irritability, sweating or lightheaded or urinating a lot. Children and teens with GAD often worry about their performance in school or sports. Adults may worry about job security or performance, health, finances, being late, responsibilities, and things like that. Now, GAD does tend to run in families. My sister has it. My mother, shockingly enough, does not. But there are some other aspects that play a role here. Remember that biopsychosocial model. We do find that there is a socialization aspect. We do find that it tends to be more common in women than in men, and it also does decline with age. So next we're going to move on to panic disorder. So panic disorder, and I want to be clear, you can have an anxiety disorder or not have an anxiety disorder, and you can have a panic attack. What's really critical about panic disorder is that not only are you having these unpredictable panic attacks, but you are also starting to modify your behavior so that you are avoiding the situations that produce that panic. So sometimes somebody with GAD may actually end up having a panic attack, but they're not that common. And additionally, their behavior doesn't necessarily change to the point where, well, I had a panic attack when I was out in public. I'm not going out in public anymore. I had a panic attack while I was driving. I'm not going to drive anymore. Somebody with panic disorder has these panic attacks, and they're going to start to engage in behaviors that are basically designed to avoid those. I have had one. They are not fun. Thankfully, I haven't had that many, but I do not enjoy them, and I don't think anybody does. They are marked by intense dread, terror. Some people report chest pain, choking, other physical symptoms. Mine showed up as dizziness, high heart rate, tingling in my face and in my fingers. And part of the reason that this happens, at least for some people, is because the sympathetic nervous system is getting very, very heightened. Another thing that we find, a lot of people having panic attacks tend to hyperventilate. So slowing down your breathing can be really useful. And a lot of people with panic disorder may misread their symptoms as a heart attack. So panic disorder is marked by these panic attacks and changing your behavior to basically avoid them. So now we are going to talk about phobia. So I want to be very clear. Phobia is very, very different than a simple fear. Dr. Gilchrist has a particular fear of snakes. A snake fell on my shoulder when I was a child, and yeah, it was a tiny little black snake, but I don't care. Snakes are creepy. So it's nice to know I have something in common with Indiana Jones, because Indiana Jones is awesome. But that's not necessarily a phobia. I will go to the reptile house. I am totally fine with looking at snakes behind plexiglass where they cannot find me. I'm totally okay walking by snakes at the pet store where they are behind plastic and they cannot find me. But if I had a phobia of snakes, I would not go anywhere where there would be the possibility of a snake. For example, over the summer, we actually found a baby snake right outside of our yard on the pavement. That baby snake was actually pretty cute. I saw another baby snake on a trail this summer. I am not afraid of baby snakes. I like them when they're little. They can't hurt me. And they're actually kind of cute. I also like looking at snakes wearing hats. If I had a phobia of snakes, I wouldn't even be able to handle that. And if I so much as saw a snake in my yard, I would probably not want to ever go out into my yard again on the off chance that a snake might be there. So a phobia has a greater intensity of fear, and you're also going to go to a greater extent to try to avoid that thing. So let's talk about a few different types of phobias. So we can have a specific phobia. This is focused on a particular object or a situation. So for example, acrophobia is a fear of heights. Claustrophobia is a fear of being in closed-in spaces. These are actually pretty common phobias. Social phobia, on the other hand, is an intense fear and avoidance of social situations. So I want to be clear about something as I mentioned social phobia. So odds are pretty good you've heard of another disorder called social anxiety. And you might actually be wondering if they are the exact same thing. And I wondered that too, so I went ahead and I looked it up. Social phobia is basically the fear of social situations, largely because you are afraid of being scrutinized and judged while you are in public, while you are in these social situations. Social anxiety is more about the nervousness and the self-consciousness that you feel. So they do kind of bleed into each other a bit, but there are some differences there in case you were curious. And then finally, with people that have panic disorder, your mind wants to really, when you're having something like this happen, and especially with panic attacks, which can be unpredictable for a lot of people, your mind is going to want to try to look for patterns or look for a way to potentially avoid it. You're becoming afraid of having another panic attack. So one of the things that we often tend to find in a lot of people who suffer from panic disorder is that they end up developing something called agoraphobia. So people with agoraphobia are basically going to try their best to avoid any situation where panic might occur. So as I kind of mentioned, if you have a panic attack in public, you're going to try to avoid public places. If you had a panic attack while you were alone in your own house, you are going to try to make sure that you are never left alone in your house. And by the way, here is another type of phobia. This is a spider, and fear of spiders is arachnophobia. Okay, so obsessive compulsive disorder, or OCD. So OCD is marked by two different things. So first of all, it is going to be characterized by unwanted repetitive thoughts, which are known as obsessions. And then also engaging in these ritualistic behaviors that are designed to reduce anxiety from obsessions. So obsessions can include, the obsessions will often include things related to contamination, inappropriate sexual content, potentially harm coming to yourself or others. And obviously, because of this, these obsessions feel like they pop up without your wanting them to. And that's not entirely incorrect. Your mind wants to think things all the time, and you can't necessarily stop that. But for these people, these obsessions become very, very distressing, and so they will engage in certain types of compulsions to basically kind of reduce that anxiety. That will include things such as repeatedly washing or cleansing themselves, counting things, or repeatedly checking on things, and this is designed to reduce the anxiety from obsessions. Now, I know what some of you are thinking. Dr. Gilchrist, sometimes when I am cooking or when I'm about to go to bed, I check things repeatedly to make sure that I, for example, turned off the oven, or that I turned on my alarm for the morning. Is that OCD? Not necessarily, because first of all, that checking does not happen because of an obsession. And second of all, checking once, twice, or maybe even 3 times is not a big deal. Sometimes we get caught up in the automaticity of doing a task, and we don't really stop to, hey, make a note of, hey, I turned this off. Hey, I turned on my alarm. So checking a couple of times is not a big deal. It gets to the point where you're constantly running late because you're checking something, or you're checking something in response to something that is really, really distressing, that might become more of a disorder. OCD has been depicted in a couple of different instances of movies and television. One example is As Good as It Gets. It is a movie where Jack Nicholson plays a very curmudgeonly, cranky writer who also suffers from OCD. Now, whether or not it is a good depiction today in 2020 is up for debate. It was originally made in 1998, but he has a habit where he doesn't like things to get dirty. He brings his own silverware, plastic silverware to restaurants. He'll buy brand new leather gloves, but he'll throw them away after one use. He washes his hands about 8 times. He has a lot of counting things with 8, or actually no, 5. In the TV show Girls, one character also has OCD, but her obsession is with doing things 8 times. And As Good as It Gets, it's 5. So everybody's going to be a little bit different there. And then finally, post-traumatic stress disorder. These disorders are marked by flashbacks. So going back to these very, very painful memories of events that have happened that were incredibly traumatic. And this is not something that is confined to war veterans. This can happen because of car accidents, natural disasters. Smedley is fighting for his place in the chair, and he is trying to kick me off and put his head on the laptop, and I will not let him. So this can happen because of car accidents, natural disasters, sexual assaults, a variety of different things. It is not just something that happens because of wartime combat. You can experience nightmares, social withdrawal, jumpiness, and insomnia. And we do find that it is more common, about 1 in 10 women report having this, than in men. This is likely due to the fact that men are often not socialized in society to seek help, especially when they are dealing with a traumatic experience. So what sort of things lead to anxiety disorders? So one potential aspect is the learning perspective. Anxiety and phobias are often due to conditioning and observational learning. So when you're a kid, and you have a really bad run-in with a big dog that barks in your face and maybe even bites you or scratches you, that can be really, really scary. And I wouldn't be surprised if somebody ended up developing a fear of dogs because of that. You have a bad experience with the dog, your mind basically learns maybe a little bit of classical conditioning there. The dog was a neutral stimulus, but it also created a dog bite or a dog scratch, which is really, really painful. So we're going to associate a dog with physical pain. And because of that, we're going to try to avoid that in the future. We also learned some of our fears by watching others. Some of you might be afraid of things like sharks or mice or rats, and you may never have actually come into contact with a mouse or a rat or a shark, but you've watched your family members or you've watched people on TV be scared of them, and you have also learned that those are things that you should fear. So it could be due to learning, but there's also a biological aspect of this. So first of all, one of the things that we know is that anxiety disorders run in families. There are genetic predispositions. So odds are pretty good if you know someone in your family with an anxiety disorder, odds are pretty good you have a predisposition for it. No, you don't get to stay on my lap. You don't. That is not for you. The laptop is for my lap right now. Additionally, natural selection also plays a role. So one of the things that we find when we ask people about the things that they're afraid of, think about what you might be afraid of. Is it heights? Is it water? Is it claustrophobia? Are you afraid of being enclosed in spaces? Are you afraid of snakes? Are you afraid of spiders? Okay, so hopefully you've thought about the thing that you're afraid of. Here's another question for you. Are you afraid of cuddly puppies? Are you afraid of pretty flowers? Are you afraid of rainbows? And odds are pretty good you're not going to be afraid of those things at all. Now, that is not to say that there aren't some people that have certain types of fears. I have seen somebody who is afraid of pickles. I have seen somebody who is afraid of feathers. Oh, somebody's trying to get settled. Come on, don't be shy. Don't be shy. And floppy. Good boy. Thank you. But people tend to be afraid of things. Like I said, people can be afraid of feathers and pickles, and people are afraid of dogs legitimately. Some dogs can be scary. But by and large, many of us are afraid of things that are good things to be afraid of. Think about it. If we weren't afraid of things like heights, we would go and do ridiculous things like jump off of cliffs. If we weren't afraid of, if we weren't afraid of water, we could potentially put ourselves in situations where we might drown. So the idea here is that we're afraid of things that could have legitimately threatened our survival in our evolutionary history. We are afraid of snakes and spiders because they could kill us. They could potentially kill us. We're not afraid of things like cuddly puppies and flowers because they don't. So this is a case of natural selection. People who were afraid of things that were legitimate threats to survival had a survival advantage. So thank yourself when you berate yourself for being afraid of something silly like a snake, because that's what kept your ancestors alive. And that's important. But this doesn't explain everything. One of the things that we find is that anxiety disorders in general are on the rise, especially in children and in young adults. And so there are a lot of different ideas as to why this is increasing. Some people would say that because society is much more precarious right now, we don't have a lot of social safety nets, that can be really anxiety inducing. Maybe it's because of social media. Maybe it's because we've created a culture that kind of relies on productivity, getting things done, doing a lot of standardized tests and being micromanaged. That can be really exhausting for people. So think a little bit about why this might be increasing. Is it because genuinely because we had things to be anxious about? Maybe. And it's why I think you should be really gentle with yourself this year. If you're anxious, we all are. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you have a disorder. It means that you are probably responding in an appropriate way. So now we're going to talk about dissociative disorders. Your book talks about this a little bit at the end, but I thought that you might find it kind of interesting. And I will also link to you in the email that I send later this afternoon. I'll link to you some YouTube videos about different types of dissociative disorders. They are very, very controversial for a variety of reasons. And we're going to talk a little bit about why. So how many of you have had the experience where you are reading a book or you're playing a video game and you suddenly kind of lose track of time? Odds are pretty good you've had that. I remember in my freshman year of college, I didn't have a computer, but my roommate did, and she let me play The Sims one night. And so she went to bed, I got on her computer, and I had my headphones on, and I played The Sims, and I'm like, oh wow, I wonder what time it is. It must be like 2 o'clock, and I look over. It's like 6 o'clock in the morning, and I'm like, I should go to bed. This is really bad. I had lost track of time. This is what is referred to as a dissociative experience. Our conscious awareness of our surroundings, of time, kind of separates from us for a little bit. And this is something that is very, very normal. What is not normal is when this dissociation happens to basically kind of create identity change, a loss of memory, and it's really disrupting your ability to live your life. So dissociative disorders basically occur when your conscious awareness separates from very painful memories and thoughts and feelings. This may include an identity change, as we see with something called a dissociative fugue. It could lead to taking on an alternate personality or an alter, which is what we see in dissociative identity disorder. And we can have a loss of memory for the time that we've dissociated, which could happen in all of these cases. So we're going to talk about 3, but we're going to focus on dissociative identity disorder in a bit more detail. It's probably the more controversial one. And a little bit less about amnesia and fugue. So dissociative identity disorder was previously known as multiple personality disorder. And part of the reason that we had that name change is because dissociative identity disorder is a controversial diagnosis, and it's definitely one of those disorders that is very much bound to culture. We don't really see a lot of people reporting dissociative identity disorder outside of the Western Hemisphere. Dissociative identity disorder is marked by having 2 or more distinct and alternating personalities known as alters. So basically, when one alter is in charge, the other is in the background. When that alter is in play, the other alter or the original person may not have a memory for what is being done while an alter is in charge. There are going to be some different each alter has their own specific mannerisms, their own specific behaviors, and unless it is brought to one's attention by somebody outside, like a peer or a family member or a therapist, the original personality will not be aware of the alters. They will just note that they have gaps in their memory where they lose several hours and they're not aware of what was done at that time. Now, I will mention that there is some skepticism about it. So you first start really hearing about dissociative identity disorder because of cases like the 3 Faces of Eve, a woman who reportedly had 3 different alters, Eve White, Eve Black, and Jane. And then a book came out about a woman named Sybil, who also reported having many alters. If I'm not mistaken, it was probably between 8 to 12. So when these stories came out, people became very, very interested in these things. And so prior to the publication of these stories, you didn't really hear that much about dissociative identity disorder. I'm not saying it's not real. There are people who absolutely have this, but generally what we have found is that once these books were published and this information got out there, the number of reported cases of DID and the number of alters that each person reports having has exploded. So when people early on, especially before the publication of Sybil, it wasn't really that uncommon to have somebody report having 2 alters. Now it's really common to have people reporting as many as 16 alters. Generally, this is very, very uncommon outside of the US. And this isn't because those areas do not experience trauma. So dissociative identity disorder is often purported, not always, this isn't always the case, but usually it is due to a trauma response. So one of the things that we find is that something traumatic happens, and basically the original personality splits off into an alter so that the original personality can basically dissociate and remove themselves from the traumatic experience. And it's been suggested that the reason that we don't really see a lot of diagnosis outside of the United States is due to the fact that this may be due to suggestibility rather than trauma itself. Many people who have reported dissociative identity disorder may be doing so under the influence of hypnosis or drugs that can potentially produce a very, very suggestible state. And it's been argued that in the case of Sybil, barbiturates, which can be really habit forming, but they can also be create hypersuggestibility, might have explained her case. One of the other things that we find that people do express skepticism about is that oftentimes these alters are not completely different from the original personality. Many of us, in fact, have normal multiple selves. The way I behave when I teach with you is not the same way that I behave when I'm with my friends or when I'm with my family or my partner. And odds are pretty good that that is the same for you. So these are just some arguments. Now, I want to clear some things up. Just a reminder, this is not me saying that it's not real. This is not me saying that it is a fad. I am saying be very skeptical of diagnoses. But if you, for example, do have dissociative identity disorder, you know, this is not me saying that you're making it up. I think it is a very complicated issue to tease apart. And I think we're still working to try to tease that apart even today. So now we're going to briefly talk about drugs and substance abuse. So I'm going to try to actually, you know, we're almost out of time and it's already been 33 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and stop here and we will talk about the other types of disorders next time.